We exist to enjoy and share the love and message of God with everyone. That's our theme for the year, and it might as well be our theme as a church. This is, in the shortest amount of words I can think of, what it really means in the big picture to be a Christian. We are meant in our Christian lives not for ourselves ultimately, but we live for the sake of other people. And it's expressed through these 6 words. Today we're looking at God. We exist to share and enjoy and share the love and message of God with everyone. And the question is, who is God? And if there's anything that human beings can mess up, it's certainly this issue of who God is. One of the things that in our secular culture, there's the belief that if you're going to believe in God or a God, it really doesn't matter who or what that God is. If it fits for you, if you like to believe in something other than yourself, then that's a good thing. Now, what's always astounding to me is that the Old Testament is a record of 1,600 years of history. And in that 1,600 years of history, whenever a nation, a city, a town, a village, a family, an individual makes something to be of highest importance other than God, whether they assume it's a God or not, but anything of higher importance, it inevitably goes bad. It may not go bad in the short term. It may not even go bad for quite a while. But eventually, this catches up with everybody. We are not designed to function with anything else higher in our life than God himself. Now, if we've done this down to us, to we as Christians, it's been my observation, both personally and talking to people, that as Christians, we tend to, the love of God tends to function on sort of a pendulum in our lives. There are some times where over on this side, the pendulum swings over here and we think about the holiness of God. And when we think about the holiness of God, what naturally, if that's the highest attribute of God, then naturally what's going to happen is we're going to put pressure on ourselves to do better, to obey. And obedience is important, and there is effort to be a godly person is important. However, pressure is not where the gospel is. Trying harder, doing better, we end up saying things like, I know I'm not worthy of God's love, and especially when we mess up and we come with our tail dragging between our legs and, the love of God. Then the pendulum swings back over on this side. And we say, yes, the love of God is the preeminent attribute of God. But then eventually what happens is we sort of forget about the holiness of God. And you hear people say things like, well, I know God wants me to be happy. And I have desires to be happy. And surely God wouldn't say no to my desires to be happy. On either end of this pendulum, we end up with some element of loneliness or emptiness, misery, broken relationships, and sort of back and forth. Here we go, during whatever season of life we happen to be in. Now, with Jesus, we have the incarnate God, God in the flesh. And as you look at the life of Jesus, and we're going to particularly do that this fall in the book of John, what you see is that he's able to live out both the love of God and the holiness of God, both in tension, but both in sort of the only way that he can do this. When I think about this, I think about John chapter 8 with the woman caught in adultery. And here all the Pharisees, they've caught this woman and they drag her out in a public forum. She's being publicly humiliated. And they accuse Jesus, what are you going to do about this? And Jesus, on one hand, fights for her, the love of God. But when the whole thing is in, it's a very common, a story that even a lot of non-Christians know. He who is without sin cast the first stone, Jesus says. And one by one, the group of Pharisees leave, starting with the oldest, getting down to the youngest. They finally go. And finally, Jesus is kneeling down, writing in the dirt with his finger, and she's standing there, tears coming down. And he says to her, does no one accuse you? And she says, no one, sir. Now, it's easy to think that's the end of the story. But the last thing he says to her is, he says to her, go and leave your life of sin. Somehow that statement, that exhortation to obey the standards of God was not taken as a slap on the wrist, But somehow the love of God communicated through Jesus made sense to her. This is for her benefit. He's not coming down on her. In John chapter 5, a paralytic is healed. And it's a wondrous thing. At the end of that passage, what Jesus says is, go and sin no more. It's an exhortation to the holiness of God, but not with that, doggone it, when are you going to get this right kind of attitude. Now, we have a picture of this in one of the most famous parables that Jesus spoke, the parable of the prodigal son. This is in Luke chapter 15. The setting is an estate where there's, you can imagine, a farmhouse, and probably if you've ever driven up into the wine country here in California, the vineyards, there were probably vineyards there, rows and rows of olive trees, grapes for wine to come. You can imagine barley fields, grains there for food, and pasture land for sheep or cattle. And the man that owned all of this, Jesus describes him as the estate owner. And he had two sons. They were young adults. And both of these sons have been raised on the farm, raised on this ranch, this estate. And the story picks up with the younger son who does an audacious thing. And in the story of the younger son and the story of the older son, which we're not going to look at today, we have pictures of our fallen human nature. What's going on inside of us? How do we naturally think apart from our relationship with God? So verse 12, and this is sort of act one of this 5-act play. The younger one said to his father, Father, give me my share of the estate. So he divided his property between them. Now, I have a good friend of mine who does estate planning, but he doesn't just do estate planning, but every year when the taxes or when the new laws happen to come that affect estate or taxes, then he's the guy that trains all the lawyers and the accountants how to follow the law in their thing. And I asked my friend one time, have you ever had somebody come to you as a young son and to see if there's some way that he can get his inheritance before his father or mother die? And my good friend was just aghast at that. Well, no, nobody would do that. Well, apparently somebody did here in this particular story. And what strikes me about the attitude of the son, which of course is true of me, is the little phrase, give me. Give me. One of the things that was just one of those, just like you just want to kind of pull your hair out or cry, is when between the age of 1 and 2, when your kids are, learning, and, we've got a few of those kids in our church now, they're walking and talking and, they're just dazzling cute. And then they hit the terrible 2s and you hear that, gimme, gimme, gimme. And you just want to go, oh no, you mean the sin nature, even in this cute little kid? And yes, there it is. And here we have here. Now, I relate to this younger son because I was sort of like this. I didn't ask my father for my share of the estate, but when I was 18, my father said he would pay for college, and he meant not just books and tuition and living expense. Where I lived and book, all that stuff, and a little bit of spending money. So when I went off to college, I was going off to school, but I was really going off in my mind to freedom. I no longer had a curfew, no longer had to follow the rules. I was pretty excited about my freedom. Now, what's different here between the younger son and me is when I went off to school, I had some means. Now, it was my father's means. But this younger son, he wants his freedom. That's one thing. But he realizes it's not going to do him that much good without means. And so he goes to his father and he demands his part of the property, and the father gives him his share of the property. Now, that closes Act 1, over at the estate. And now the story goes way across, long distance to Acts chapter 2, verse 13. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had and set off for a distant country. Now, there are a lot of times in our lives when I think about the setting off. We have dreams in our life, and this was probably a man in his early 20s. Sometimes you have dreams in your 30s or 40s or 50s about how life is supposed to play out. Some of you ladies dream about a man who will care about your emotional needs and wants to have a relationship with you, or he relates to you and you relate to him. And a man has a dream when he gets married of how his physical needs are going to be met. That's pretty common. You dream when you have your first job about a career and what that's going to entail as it plays out. When you have kids, you dream about your kids hanging around the Christmas tree and opening presents and just having a delightful time. Sometimes like this, your dream is about Party City and being party animals and your friends that are going to be out there and hit the nightclub scene. There are lots of dreams. He sets out for a distant country. And then the scripture says, or Jesus says, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. Now, we squander our lives in lots of different ways, not just with wild living. I tried that for a couple years, and I found that a rather empty phenomenon after a couple years. But we also squander our lives whenever we put anything else higher in our life than God. Over Christmas, I was kind of laughed because the Peloton, have you heard of the company Peloton? Does the high energy bikes, high income bikes, and the little thing is worldwide. You know, they got in trouble. Sometimes fitness becomes the most important thing in our life. Sometimes for you ladies, becoming a mom, seeing yourself as mom becomes the most important thing in your life. For a lot of us men, what becomes the most important thing is being impressive or being the smartest guy in the room. There are lots of things that we can put up in first place. And after a long period of time, we realize that's really not enough. Squander our life here in wild living. I mentioned that I came to Christ at age 20. And the night I became a Christian, I was 20 years old and about 6 months old. And it seemed to me, after having just given my life to Christ to become a Christian, I had this very strong sense of what have I done with the last 20 years of my life, the first 20 years of my life. I remember standing there in the darkness at night in East Texas at this camp and wondering, if I lived to 70, I've already lived 20 years. And what have I gotten for that 20 years where I had my freedom and the means, but without wisdom? It felt like I had squandered 20 years of my life. Now, what this young man realizes, and if you're a note taker, this would be a good place to jot this down. He learns a valuable lesson here. Sin disappoints. It may not disappoint at the beginning. For a while, sin seems like this is great, having the time of my life. But eventually it comes to a place where disappointment happens. In verse 14, the second thing happened that he didn't see coming. A famine hit the land, and it affected the economy. You know, you can go back a number of years when our country went through the recession in 2008. The unforeseen hit. This is the second thing he didn't see coming. Sin disappoints, and the unforeseen circumstances, a famine. It affects the whole country. There's a shortage of food. Inflation happens when there's a shortage of food. Prices are going up. He's run out of money. What in the world is he going to do? Verse 15, he realizes he has to get a job, but in a shrinking economy like that, jobs are hard to find. The unemployment rate tends to go up. It's hard to get jobs. And so this Jewish young man takes the only job available to him. He becomes a pig farmer. It's hard to believe any Jewish boy, young man, would take a job as a pig farmer. But that's how desperate he was. And we pick up the story, and here is Act number 3, Act 3. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When I was in high school, my first real job, other than being a paper boy, was I worked at a local drugstore after school, and they had a little hamburger. You could make hamburgers and malts and French fries and apple pie and ice cream and stuff like that. And amazingly, I know this is hard to believe, but I was a cook during that time. And to my knowledge, no one became ill. But it's kind of a fun job. I enjoyed the cooking part of that. I enjoyed eating the things that were, all the junk food that was available to me. Onion rings and French fries and vanilla malts. Oh my gosh, it was glorious. But I was also the bus boy. I was the guy that took the orders. Did the cash register. It was just kind of a one-man show, a little small thing. But what I remember the most from that is that when I cleaned the bus, when I bussed the tables, I had my little tray, and I put the stuff in the tray, and then I go back to the kitchen, and the first thing you do is you take every bit of food that's uneaten, and you put it in the slop, about a 5-gallon bucket, 5-gallon paint bucket. All that slop goes in there. Now, that had been accumulating since the store opened while I was in school. By the time I got there, about 3:30 in the afternoon, there was an unmistakable stench wafting up from that 5-gallon bucket. And I worked, I think, till about 6 and was continuing to add to that. And it was just a mess. And a local farmer would come to the drugstore at the end of the day, and he would take the slop bucket, and he would take it to feed his pigs, just like here. But here, the man longed to fill his stomach with the pods the pigs were eating. He had a job. But, after you take away federal taxes and state taxes and local taxes, after you take out Medicare and Social Security, what's left? He learned the difference between gross and net. And at first, he could go to Ralph's and he could still buy his food, but apparently even he didn't have enough money to go to Ralph's anymore. And suddenly what looked like, all that stuff in that 5-gallon bucket didn't look so bad. Then says, but no one gave him anything. And here's one of those strange things about sin, is that sometimes when you hit the skids and you are down on your luck, as we say, and life is hard, I'm always amazed at how often you feel alone. When things are, when you're on top of the world and you're partying every Friday and Saturday night and you've got money, you've got lots of friends. But suddenly when life is tough and you're struggling just day by day, it's amazing how many people just don't show up anymore in your life. And this is the third realization, I think, that strikes this young man. Sin disappoints, and the unforeseen happens. The unforeseen. And then third, many walk out. Verse 17, when he came to his senses, he said, how many of my father's hired men have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? He's just about ready to hit bottom. He's realized that he's built a house of cards, and all those cards have fluttered down and are all lying face down in front of him. What have I done with my life? Verse 18 and 19, I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired men. Now, one of the things I think is always sort of sad is we live in the era of faux apologies. It's amazing how creative our pride can be whenever it comes to apologies. And you've heard a lot of them. Well, if anybody was offended by what I did, I'm sorry. Or even just the statement of I'm sorry can mean lots of different things. I think a lot of times it means I'm sorry I was caught. And then one of my favorite ones that runs in the sports world particularly is when you say something, or particularly when you do something that is just, over the top. And you say something like, well, what I did wasn't me. Or what I said wasn't me. Really? Really? Apparently it was you for a while. We have all kinds of ways of trying to run around this, but he faced up to this. He said, Father, I have sinned against heaven. There's something he realizes was broken in his relationship with God. Through this whole thing, something happened there. And against you, his father. Now, I wonder what he thought about with his father. I wonder if he thought about, oh my gosh, in that Jewish culture, to have a son that rejected your family and rejected the family business and left the land to go somewhere else. The father, would he be publicly humiliated? What was it like to go to the synagogue on the weekend, on Saturday? What was it like to go to town and meet your friends when they ask you about your younger son? I wonder what kind of shame he felt, or if he did feel shame about this with him. I wonder if he felt if his father was wounded by this. Then it says, he called to your son, make me like one of your hired men. The phrase that strikes me so much in the middle of the story is, he says, I am not worthy. I am not worthy. Anybody ever said that before? The quietness of your heart? I've said that a lot of times about me. When the pendulum of holiness swings over here, and I realize I am not meeting up to the standards of holiness and how I'm supposed to be, the most natural conclusion we sinfully draw is, I am not worthy. Now, from the Bible's point of view, or from Jesus' point of view, well, duh! Of course not. That's the whole premise of the gospel. None of us are worthy of the love of God. That shouldn't be a big surprise. But all of my life, probably all of your life, there are going to be times when the pendulum swings over here and you're going to go, I'm not worthy of the love of God. And you're just going to kind of shrink around for a few days or a few weeks and hope you don't run into any Christian, or maybe you hope you don't run into me. And until your conscience sort of stabilizes and comes back to normal. And, we all do that. And it's a reflection of just what he does here. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. There's probably no greater lie than that one. Of course I'm not worthy of the love of God. Of course I'm not worthy of somebody who's perfect, who died for me. Of course not. And over the course of my life as a Christian, that's one of the things that your heart slowly begins to go, whoa, wow. I don't have to go to the I'm not worthy room anymore. Ever. Again. And then the scene shifts to Act 4. He got up and went to his father, traveling back across from the far country, back towards the estate where his father lived. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him. And suddenly the lights shift once again from Act 4 to Act 5. And instead of being the pigsty, now it's back over at the estate. And the picture that Jesus paints here is of something of the father sitting on his front porch. And he's looking out on the horizon. And what you see is him gazing and longing. He wants his son to come home. He hopes he'll come home. There's nothing more important to him than to be in relationship with his son. Does it matter what the son did? Not to the father. It's a very different kind of love than what we're used to. We saw that the son was longing for food to eat, but he wasn't the only one longing in this parable. The father is longing for relationship with his son. We pick this up in verse 20. His father saw him. The idea is at a long distance, maybe coming over a hill on the horizon, and was filled with compassion for him. And this is one of those things that just explodes in this story. Because if it was you or me, the father sees the son and he might roll his eyes. Or he might think about all the times when he had to go into town and face his friends and those questions and those looks about, well, what kind of father were you that your son would leave you the way he did and have the audacity to ask you for his share of the inheritance before? He's not wounded. He's not stewing. He's not angry. He's longing and gazing. He had compassion for him. And it says he ran to his son. Thinking about the older man, I can relate to this. Running across the countryside there, running to his young son. One of the things I think about is how quickly God runs to mercy. Just like that. Sees his son, runs to extend mercy, as we'll see. Threw his arms around him. Now, this is where, I'm probably reading more into this than I should. But after having worked at that drugstore and the pig slop and all that stuff, it's been in there for all day until 6, the stench of that didn't just sort of waft around me it wafted into me. And when I went home, I was kind of stinky and smelly. And my mother would say, Seth Jr., go take a shower. And I'd go off and take a shower and get that pig smell off. And after working in the food industry there for a couple hours, I usually had food all over my clothes. I'm great at spilling. Well, this guy, in the middle of a famine, probably had only one set of clothes, and had he ever washed those clothes, it's probably doubtful. He stunk to high heaven. I don't know if he could stink any worse than he did. And yet, without missing a beat, Jesus says the Father threw his arms around him and kissed him. Now, there are three things that strike me about the love of God seen in the Father here, and this is the first one. What is portrayed here, what Jesus portrays in the Father, is undeserved, lavish affection. Undeserved, lavish affection. Undeserved, lavish affection. The Father said so the Son goes into his what he's going to say and says, no, we don't need to hear all that. You're back. That's the point. The point is you're back. And I'm glad you're back. And then the scene shifts from out there in the middle of the land there back to the estate, and the estate owner, the father, talks to his servants and says, quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. He's not saying, okay, well, the son's back and he's a mess, and would somebody do his laundry and somebody get him some clean clothes, That's not the imagery here. The best robe in the Greek, it's sort of like double emphatic. The best robe, that one, get that one. And then so he put his ring on, and the idea here is the signet ring of the family. The family signet ring, the ring that identified him as the Father's son. When he went into town, he would wear that ring. When he would be out in the fields with the hired servants, he would wear that ring. In his quiet moments, he could look down and see that ring, the ring of the family. Now, what's striking here is that the son is not a son because of what he did. He's a son completely because of what the Father did. He cannot lose his sonship because of what he does, which is clearly evident in the story. He is a son because of what his Father decides and what he does. So the first thing that struck me, I mentioned just a minute ago, is undeserved, lavish affection. The second thing that strikes me here is an honored family member. This is an identity. This can become who you are, how you see yourself. You look in the mirror, and this is what you see. I am an honored family member. And then the story goes on. He says, bring the fatted calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. And the idea is something very festive going on. And when I think about this, the third thing that strikes me about the love of God, it is an extravagant, stunning joy. Extravagant, stunning joy. An undeserved, lavish affection. An honored family member. And an extravagant, stunning joy. And then the Father finishes this part of the story with two metaphors. For this son of mine was dead, now not physically dead, but personally dead and relationally dead. Was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found, and they began to listen to the Father's lecture. I hope this is a lesson to all of you. You don't want to do what he did. We're bringing him back. We'll figure this out. There is none of that. It's about celebration. Celebration. On the back of your handout, I want to finish with 4 lessons in a story. God's kindness was expressed before the Son expressed his repentance. That seems important to me. God's kindness was expressed before the Son expressed his repentance. Number two, not one word of upbraiding is ever heard from the Father. When my mind starts to go there, perhaps I should remember this. Every word and action of the Father rings of affection. Affection. And number four, it was the Father that created the joy, celebration, feast, and festival. This is what the Father chose to do, and he was happy to do it. He was glad to do it. He was celebrating. And he wanted to include everyone in it. This is the love of God that we enjoy and that we share with everyone. There was an elderly man who was about 80 years old, and he walked into a doctor's office. It was 8:30 in the morning. He walked over to the window, and the nurse was there, and he said, I was wondering if somebody could take the stitches out of my thumb, out of my left thumb. And if possible, I have an appointment at 9 o'clock. I'd like to be able to go to my 9 o'clock appointment, which is 30 minutes away. Well, there was nobody else in the doctor's office, and she said, well, we'll do the best we can to get you to your appointment at 9. She brought the doctor out to examine the thumb, and the thumb had sufficiently healed that the sutures could be taken out. And so the nurse got the necessary supplies and sat down with the 80-year-old man. She was in her 20s. He was about 60 years older than she was. And she sat down and began to slowly, meticulously pull the sutures out of his thumb. And she began a conversation with him. And she said, now, do you have an appointment at 9 o'clock with the doctor? And he said, no. He said, no, I go over to the nursing home every morning at 9 o'clock to have breakfast with my wife. She said, oh, okay. And then she said, well, how's her health doing? And the elderly gentleman said, well, her health is good, except she's a victim of Alzheimer's disease. The nurse thought about this in a moment, and she looked at her watch and was wondering if he was going to get there on time. And he said, will she be upset if you're not there by 9 o'clock? And the elderly gentleman said, no, she won't be upset. She doesn't know who I am. The nurse thought about that a moment, and she's getting ready to say something, and she said, how long has she not known you? He said, well, it's about 5 years now. And you go every morning to have breakfast with her, even though she doesn't know who you are? And at that moment, he took his right hand, his free hand, and he patted her hand, and then with a glint in his eye and a little 80-year-old smile and a little bit of aura and warmth about his face, he said to the nurse, she doesn't know who I am, but I know who she is. That's a picture of the love of God that he has for us. That's the God we enjoy, and that's the God that we share. Let's pray together. Father, all the junk that we let our minds run about with love and your love and is it deserved and merited and am I living up, all that stuff, it's a bunch of crapola. The point is not how we're doing. The point is what you think about us. That's what matters. Would you help cement us in the love of God, displayed on a cross and lived out in story form as in this parable?